Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're exploring one of the absolute most fascinating puzzles in the world. What actually makes you, you? I mean, think about it. Every single day, you make choices, you react to things, you feel certain emotions, right? But where do all of those traits really come from? We're going to look closely at a really interesting conversation between a clinical psychologist and a cellular neuroscientist to figure out the actual science behind our personalities.
Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to just take a second and think about your own personality. Are you naturally shy? Or maybe you're super outgoing? Do you get angry easily? Or are you just kind of naturally calm? Now ask yourself, do you act the way you do because of the DNA you were born with? Or is it because of the way you were raised and your childhood experiences? It's the classic debate, right? Nature versus nurture.
You know, in modern psychology, there's actually a pretty strange double standard happening. When doctors talk about things like ADHD, autism, or bipolar disorder, pretty much everyone completely agrees that genetics and biology play a huge role. But, as our source material points out, when it comes to personality and conditions like narcissism, suddenly biology just gets tossed right out the window. A lot of professionals end up blaming personality issues completely on childhood trauma, like bad parenting or neglect. They basically act like we're all born as completely blank slates, totally ignoring the actual biology inside our brains.
So to understand why ignoring biology is a mistake, let's move into our first major piece of the puzzle, your genetic rulebook.
You might sometimes hear scientists say that personality is polygenic. Now, let's break that down so simply that literally a child could understand it. Poly just means many, and genic means genes. So it simply means your personality isn't created by just one single narcissism gene or one shy gene. Instead, it's a lot like a giant set of Legos. Thousands of tiny biological instructions are teaming up and working together to build a single trait. Now, because it's so complex, a lot of people kind of have a hard time wrapping their heads around it, but the science absolutely shows those tiny instructions are hard at work.
Let's look at a really great example from the source material to make this even easier to visualize. Picture yourself deciding you want to be the absolute fastest runner in the world. You're going to the Olympics. If you go to the gym, work out every single day, and train incredibly hard, you will definitely get faster than you are right now. But realistically, can you ever train hard enough to outrun Usain Bolt? Well, no, you probably can't. And that's because your genetics set a strict range of possibilities. Usain Bolt was born with a genetic rulebook that made his maximum speed incredibly high. Obviously, if he just sat on the couch all day, he'd be slow. He still had to work really hard to reach his limit. But for the rest of us, no matter how hard we work, our genetic limit is simply lower. And the exact same rule applies to your personality. Your genes create a strict boundary for exactly how extroverted, or agreeable, or emotionally resilient you can possibly be.
So the crucial point is that the numbers backing this up are just staggering. Based on massive sets of twin studies, where separated identical twins somehow end up having remarkably similar personalities despite growing up in completely different families, scientists estimate that genetics explain 50 to 70% of the variation in personality across the population. Look at it this way. If a doctor told you that your genetics had a 50 to 70% impact on getting a physical disease, there is no way you'd ignore it. So we certainly shouldn't ignore it when it comes to human behavior.
But wait, we definitely can't ignore the other side of the puzzle either. Let's shift our focus to the environment's role and look at how the world around us shapes who we become.
If we actually put these two forces head to head, we can see exactly how they team up. Your genetics are basically writing the rulebook. They're setting the absolute limits of who you can be. But your environment, meaning the way your parents treated you, the friends you made, the traumas you experienced, that acts like a slider on a soundboard. Your childhood experiences determine exactly where you land inside that pre-written genetic rulebook.
And honestly, this explains a massive mystery in psychology. Imagine two different children going through the exact same incredibly difficult toxic childhood. One child might actually be born with a genetic rulebook that gives them extreme emotional resilience. They might survive that really tough environment and grow up to be a perfectly healthy adult. But the other child might be born with a high genetic susceptibility to narcissism. Going through that identical bad experience triggers those specific traits, and they end up developing a personality disorder. So yes, the environment absolutely matters, but it reacts completely differently depending on the specific DNA it's interacting with.
All right, now we're going to introduce arguably the most mind-blowing concept from our source material. Let's talk about the sneaky feedback loop.
I want to pose a really intriguing question to you here. Do our genes secretly choose our hobbies and our environments? I mean, we love to think we have total free will, right? That we just randomly happen to like certain things or end up in certain situations. But science actually suggests our biology might be pulling the strings from behind the curtain.
Let's just walk through this brilliant roller coaster analogy from our neuroscientist source. Imagine you could swab the DNA of people who absolutely love roller coasters and then swab the people who hate them. You would very likely find a genetic trait for thrill-seeking. So here is the loop. Genes make a person naturally crave thrills, and because of that craving, the person happily chooses to visit a theme park. Now, if a psychologist studies them and says, wow, people at theme parks act like thrill seekers, the theme park must be causing this behavior, they are totally missing the point. You have to ask, did the environment cause the behavior, or did their hidden genetic traits send them into that environment in the first place?
And this brilliantly illustrates that nature and nurture aren't just sitting in neat little separate boxes. They are hopelessly tangled together in a feedback loop. You don't just have pure genetics over here and pure environment over there. You actually have a massive third slice, the gene-environment loop. We naturally self-select into environments, friendships, and situations that perfectly match our hidden genetic traits.
Because this feedback loop is so incredibly complicated, we need to look at the dangers of ignoring the biology entirely. Let's move into our next section. Guessing is not science.
Let's really break down the difference between real science and what is sometimes unfortunately happening in therapy offices. Evidence-based science relies on actual testable data. You can measure it, you can prove it, and most importantly, you can actually prove it wrong. On the flip side, you have anecdote-based guessing. This is when professionals make really complex assumptions about someone's childhood trauma causing their personality, but they're using untestable hypotheses. And listen, if you can't test a theory to see if it's false, you are basically walling yourself off from the scientific method entirely.
To highlight this, our source points to an example where a medical doctor diagnosed a highly polarizing, famous public figure entirely from watching them on television. The doctor confidently claimed that this figure's grandiosity and aggression were 100% an unconscious trauma response to a toxic father. But the neuroscientist points out that doing this is scientifically dangerous. Looking at an adult's behavior and just guessing what their childhood must have been like from afar, without knowing them at all, and completely ignoring the complex genetics passed down from that exact same father, well, that isn't evidence-based medicine. It's essentially fortune-telling.
To really challenge the idea that trauma equals destiny, the neuroscientist asks a very sharp, analytical question. In that exact same example we just talked about, the public figure had a brother who grew up in the exact same toxic home, with the exact same father, but that brother tragically struggled with alcoholism and drank himself to death. So, if the toxic childhood environment purely dictates behavior, why on earth did one sibling seek out power and the other seek out addiction? Without factoring in genetics and biology, you simply cannot explain why siblings with identical childhoods have vastly different outcomes in life. We've covered a lot of ground today, so let's start bringing all these puzzle pieces together into a single, unified picture. Because making you who you are is truly the ultimate team effort.
When you get right down to it, here are the raw ingredients of you. First, you have your genetic DNA rulebook, which sets your boundaries. Second, you have your childhood home and upbringing, which essentially pushes you around inside those boundaries. And third, you have the friends and environments you choose, which, as we learned, your genes likely pushed you toward in the first place. The really major takeaway here is that absolutely no human trait is 100% genetic, and absolutely no trait is 100% environmental. It is always a mixture of the two working together.
You know, sometimes psychology pushes back against genetics just because the biology is just too complicated to fully understand yet. But our source shares this amazing anecdote about a college class that was jointly taught by a philosopher and a physicist, and they were talking about the atomic bomb. The physicist was up there explaining all this extremely complex quantum mechanics, and the philosopher argued back that the physics didn't make intuitive sense, so it couldn't be true. The physicist just leaned back, looked at him, and said, "Yeah, man, but the bomb exploded." The evidence of reality is right there staring you in the face, whether you understand the deep mechanisms or not. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly that story applies to our own brains. Just because the human brain is wildly complicated to understand doesn't mean the biological evidence isn't real. Psychology might not be able to fully map out the molecular biology of narcissism or shyness tomorrow morning, but they absolutely cannot ignore the hard genetic data that proves it exists. Denying the biological reality just because it's super complicated is exactly like pretending the bomb didn't explode.
We've seen that the wiring of your brain and your genetics are a massive part of your story. You are a beautifully complex mix of the biology you inherited and the life you've actually lived. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. As you go about your week and make your choices, how much of your personality do you think was already written in your rulebook before you were even born? Thanks for exploring this amazing biological puzzle with me today in this explainer. Keep learning and stay curious.